Gilbert Gottfried. I'm here with my co-host Frank Santopadre, and this is Gilbert and Frank's Colossal Obsessions. And we're once again recording at Nutmeg with our engineer, Frank Verderosa.
Colossal Obsessions.
You have such a lilt in your voice.
Yes.
I'm just impressed that it took you how many weeks to get the name of this show down?
No, it took me a few years.
A couple.
Yeah.
2.5
Yeah.
2.5 years. We're grading on a curve. We actually have a guest for a mini episode this week, and it's somebody that I've known. I'm trying to get my headphones to fit my head. It's somebody I've known a very long time. Mr. Craig Shemin is here with us.
That is me.
Craigie.
Frankie.
It's so good to see you. How shall we introduce you? You are the president of the Jim Henson Legacy?
That is correct. I'm also a freelance writer, producer, and doer of things.
You are a doer of things. You are a former staff writer for the Muppets as well. You are the editor and the writer of the Muppets Character Encyclopedia.
That is correct.
Do we have this right?
Yes, and it's available wherever fine books about Muppets are sold.
How long have you and I known each other?
I think we met in a writing workshop in the 90s.
We did.
And I think because people were writing scripts for either Seinfeld or Murphy Brown. That dates.
You had to date us. Yeah. And one of the instructors in that workshop was Suzanne Collins.
Yes.
Who has become
wrote The Hunger Games.
Become quite a success.
And, you remember one of the others was esteemed sitcom writer Lee Kalsheim.
Lee Kalsheim, who wrote All in the Family.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we would always talk about him because he had an eye patch on at the time and he looked like a pirate.
What if Lee's listening to this?
Well, hello, Lee.
Have you considered that?
I'd have. There's nothing wrong with looking like a pirate.
Now, we had requests from our listeners saying, when the hell are you people going to do something about the Muppets? So I said, okay, well, we'll get a Muppet expert in here. I just happen to know one.
I know a few things about Muppets.
Yeah. Now, you also had a recent encounter with my co-host.
Yes. Well, Gilbert and Dara brought the kids to one of the screenings. I do monthly screenings at the Museum of the Moving Image. We're about to open an exhibit there. And I saw Gilbert and the kids and Dara come in. And I introduced myself and like, oh, I'm a friend of Frank Santopadre's. And Gilbert said, I wasn't aware Frank had any friends.
That's not a bad impression.
And I did a few things with the Muppets.
Yeah, I actually looked up your resume.
Okay.
He has a Muppet resume?
Yes. You have your own page on the Muppet Wiki.
Ooh.
Wow, he doesn't know what that is. He doesn't
but it sounds good. It sounds obscene.
Among other things, you were on Sesame Street.
Yes.
You did an appearance. You played a guy.
Denny the Distractor.
Yes.
Ooh.
His only job was to be an annoying distraction to a game show contestant who was trying to accomplish
And
things.
somehow they thought of me.
How would they ever think
Yeah.
of you? And on Muppets Tonight?
I win a date with Kermit.
Yes.
I win a date with Kermit the Frog.
Kermit goes to pick up his date with a bouquet of flowers, and Gilbert is the number one fan.
Some comedy writers were sitting around saying, you know what would be funny? If Kermit's date turns out to be Gilbert Gottfried.
Yes.
I think that clip's available.
Yes.
I think that's on.
You can see it on
that's
YouTube.
online, yeah, on YouTube.
You did a voice cameo on Bear in the Big Blue House.
Oh, my God, yes.
You did. You played a possum with Brad Garrett as the other possum.
Wow, you remember that?
That one, I remember the title, Bear in the Big Blue House, and I remember doing a voice for it.
Brad Garrett, another guy he has not asked to do this show.
And then the final one that I have on the list is a musical excerpt, which I think we may be able to listen to.
Ooh, did you bring your own clips?
We brought clips. Now, this was to set it up, because that's what you do with a clip.
Yeah, this is like the old Carson show. I'm so excited. He brought his own clip.
The Muppets did an album called Kermit Unpigged. And She Drives Me Crazy was the single off the album. So they did a music video as the kids did.
As in unplugged.
Yes.
Right.
That tells you when that was done.
And how long ago it was, Bruce Willis was still married to Demi Moore.
Right, because they show up in the video. Do you remember who else shows up in that video?
Oh, God.
Phil Collins.
Yes.
David Hasselhoff is in that video.
Hasselhoff's in it. Conan. Bunch of people.
Yeah, and we set up, a white thing in the little studio that Henson had over on the east side.
Right.
And one by one, we would bring in these celebrities to come in.
You were
and
present for this?
I was. And Gilbert was one of them.
Was this in the townhouse right on 68th Street?
No, this was on the Carriage House studio on 67th Street.
Okay.
I remember it being very hot that day.
Yes.
Yes.
You remember that?
I remember that. I remember going
He
over
remembers
there,
discomfort.
and it was
He remembers his
yes.
character, too.
Yes.
You took me to that townhouse. I had the street wrong. It
Yeah.
was 67th
Yeah.
Street. And was there a spiral staircase?
Well, there's the townhouse on 69th Street with the spiral
oh,
staircase.
that's the one I'm thinking of.
And then they
Excuse
had
me.
the studio
The one on
a couple blocks
69th.
away.
Right. That was a treat.
Yeah.
And you showed me Jim Henson's old office.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was great.
She drives me crazy, and I can't help myself. Bum, bum.
Well, we actually have the clip.
This special pick is
That's Paula Poundstone.
you won't make it without me. That is one guarantee. Oh, girl, you drive me crazy. Like no.
What was that?
I don't know.
Oh, yeah. You remember doing this?
Oh, yes.
But
yes.
this was one of your first big musical.
Yeah, oh, yeah. And then I went on to be Tevye and Fiddler on the Roof.
You even remember the characters you played
Yeah.
in this thing.
Oh, yeah. And I remember I did the episode of the Muppets of Sesame Street when the actor strike was going on because the actors were still allowed to do Sesame Street.
Oh yeah, I
because it
think they
was-
had they had a separate deal. It was a separate contract.
Yeah, and so that was
And I should mention my wife, who's here and there, Stephanie DeBruzzo.
The lovely Stephanie DeBruzzo.
She remembers you coming in with the kids and everything. It was
Stephanie was wonderful in Avenue Q.
She was.
And I went 3 times. And I waited, my wife and I waited for her. I'm turning in my seat to wave to Stephanie. My wife and I waited for her at the backstage door. Is that what they call it?
yes.
To meet and greet. She was terrific.
I hope she met you and greeted you. And
She did.
Okay.
and she was demonstrating her Johnny Mathis
Yeah,
imitation
she did
to us.
Wait, she did a killer Johnny Mathis for us in the hallway before we turned the mics on. Now tell us a little bit before we get into Jim Henson and his history and his and the legacy. How did you become a Henson / Muppet person in the first place?
Well, I was a Muppet fan. I
Mm-hmm.
came into it from being a fan, and I was in college trying to figure out what to do with my life. And I happened to see a Henson documentary on TV, and I'm saying, "Oh, gee, I wonder if they do internships." And I called up the next day and got myself an interview to come in during spring break, and I ended up being an intern at the Henson Company. And then I started full time for them soon after graduation.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember that when I was an intern, that's when I met Jim Henson. It was the company softball game.
Oh, that's where you met him.
Yeah. He didn't know who I was, so he came up and started a conversation because he knew everyone else.
Right.
He was such a nice man. And he borrowed my baseball glove for the game, and I had him sign it afterwards. So I think I have the only game-used Jim Henson baseball glove.
You still have it.
I still
Now,
have it.
was
Wow.
Jim Henson one of those people who didn't believe in doctors or medicine?
Well, he came from a Christian Science family, but he was not that adamant about it. He was, he had doctors. He saw doctors. It was just an unfortunate confluence of events when he died because he was a guy who didn't get sick a lot, and he had a strep pneumonia that was so fast moving that it just came on all of a sudden. And, he didn't really think he was as sick as he was getting. And then by the time he realized how sick he was, it was too late.
Tragic. And I'm piecing this together from memory, and I'm trying to remember the townhouse on 69th Street. Wasn't there an attempt made or an effort made to preserve the office as as Jim had left it?
Well, there
and
was
not to disturb it?
Well, for years it was pretty much that office was pretty much the way he left it. And I think for a brief time, the Jim Henson legacy and the family, we looked into turning that building into a museum.
Right.
And we did studies, we had things made, but it was the situation was that the building is relatively small. It's a New York townhouse, so the studies came back that we would not be able to get enough traffic through the building to get enough revenue to make it going as an ongoing.
And so they wound
operation.
up selling the property eventually.
They sold the property. The Henson Company is now based in Long Island City and on the old Chaplin Studio lot in LA.
Sure.
Now, there's like a million commercials and TV shows with puppets that look like the Muppets. And so obviously the influence or plagiarism is going on. And now, where did the style of the Muppets come from originally? Were they influenced by?
I think that Jim really was influenced by Disney a lot in terms of seeing the big white eyes with the black pupils in the center of them. But he really developed his techniques a lot. He drew from a lot of things because...
in my school, there were a lot of black pupils.
You set him up.
Yes.
So when he was starting out, he sort of made two big discoveries. One was that you didn't need a puppet stage if you were using the TV camera to, isolate the characters so the puppets could interact with humans. And then using the TV monitor, when you're a puppeteer and you're performing into a TV monitor, you can be the audience for your own performance. So you can instantly see what the audience at home is seeing. So you can, move around, you can compensate for things, you can look at the camera, you can know the timing is really precise. And that was sort of the two big, really big revolutions in puppetry that he brought to television. Because he was not really a puppeteer. When Jim started, he was a high school kid. And he turned to puppetry just because he wanted to get into television. He was fascinated with television. Yeah, and he saw there was a local TV station that wanted to use young puppeteers as part of a morning news show on the weekends they were doing. And Jim said, "Oh, they want to do puppeteers. I can learn puppetry." And he got a couple of books out of the library, taught himself puppetry, built some puppets, and he got himself a job because he wanted to be around television. And this was 1955, so things were just, starting out.
When did he work with Stan Freberg? We were talking on the phone about some of his early gigs.
He actually never worked with him, but he worked with him indirectly because Jim's first TV show was this local show called Sam and Friends for 5 minutes in Washington, D.C., and he would lip sync to records. And he would lip sync to Bob and Ray records and to Stan Freberg, basically. And they would just get the records from the record library and just lip sync and come up with a little sketch to do to the audio. And they didn't bother to get Stan's permission.
Right.
And then Stan heard that these people, he heard that these people were using it. And then when he came from D.C. and he went to the studio and visited, he really liked what they were doing. He's, you can use my stuff anytime. And now, for years after that, Freberg took credit for some of the Muppets' success.
Oh, did he?
Oh, yeah.
How convenient.
As did Steve Allen, who gave him the first primetime shot on TV. And
Steve, we found out in talking to Carl Reiner that Steve Allen was instrumental in the birth of the 2,000-Year-Old Man. He was the one that sent Mel Brooks and Reiner into the to take the. They were doing it at parties.
Steve Allen, sort of the nexus of the
he kind of
show
is.
business
Now,
universe.
I remember when I was a kid watching Ed Sullivan, and the Muppets were, recurring guests on the Ed Sullivan Show. But back then, they would do sketches, but there were no recognizable Muppets. There was no Kermit or Piggy. Or
Kermit popped up in one or two, but what they did then was sort of these self-contained acts where they would have a beginning, middle, and end, because it was, they needed to have something that didn't rely on you having seen them before. And they did 25 appearances on Sullivan. and Sullivan would always, mess up their introductions. And
Yeah. I remember,
yeah.
and this is before Sesame Street.
Yeah.
and other variety shows too.
Yeah.
Is it Jimmy Dean?
Jimmy
Comes
Dean,
to
that was
mind?
the first time that the Muppets had like a regular character. Rolf the dog was Jimmy Dean's hound dog buddy. For
Do you remember Jimmy Dean? He became the sausage guy, but
Yeah.
he was a big bad John. He had a variety show.
It's so funny to think that it's like, to this day, when I think of Jimmy Dean, I always think, now, I know he was in show business
He's one of
before
those
making
guys.
sausages.
Yeah,
I know that they...
yeah.
No, he did. He had a great bit with Rolf every week, and he really made Rolf real. He knew how to interact with him. And, I heard stories from Jane Henson that, one day Jimmy Dean, asked Jim, he came to Jim with an investment opportunity, and it was the sausage company.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool.
And Jim passed on it because he really, he didn't know anything about sausage.
Oh, jeez.
What were some of the other variety shows?
Well, I mean, Sullivan, Jimmy Dean, he did Al Hurt, the musician.
Al
He
Hurt,
had-
the trumpet
yeah,
player,
he
had a variety
show called Fanfare.
I did not know
Yeah,
that.
Herb Alpert did a show.
Sure.
The Hollywood Palace. They did.
Oh,
a
I
few
remember Hollywood
Palaces.
Palace. Remember Hollywood Palace on Saturday night?
That was the show that rose out of the ashes of the Jerry Lewis show, I think, because they had gotten the.
The 3 hour
Yeah,
Jerry
they
Lewis,
had done all the renovations on the theater.
Right, which we
And,
talked about with
yeah.
Tom Sharpling.
Yes.
The Jerry Lewis tile.
Yes.
Yeah. If I remember Hollywood Palace correctly, it was sort of a precursor to SNL because it had a host. It
Yep.
had a celebrity host every week.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty much.
Yeah. I remember Adam West singing on there as Batman,
Yes.
which you can see online.
His hit Miranda.
Miranda. Yeah.
And I heard like a lot of the Muppets were based on real people.
Well, there were a few. I mean, the one that I think of was Dr. Teeth was based on Dr. John. At
Oh,
least
that's
Oh,
cool.
okay.
the singing
makes
voice
sense.
was not so much the visual.
Sure.
But but a lot of the characters, some of the ones that you see on Sesame Street are based on real people.
So when does Jim kind of break in? He's starting to do local television, but when does he kind of start breaking into the mainstream? I mean, these Jimmy Dean and Hollywood Palace, this is the early 60s.
Well, all that time he was also doing experimental films.
Right, and he did an Oscar.
commercials, lots of commercials. Yeah,
Right.
did an Oscar.
I was gonna ask you about that, Oscar-nominated
nominated experimental film called Timepiece, which is really really fun. I mean, it's really weird but fun, and a lot of quick cutting and stuff. But I think it wasn't until Sesame Street that he really, the Muppets became one of those overnight successes that took 15 years to
Sure.
get
Sure.
And the Muppets got more and more like adult. Like you could watch it no matter what your age.
Yeah, what's interesting is that it started out as adult because the very first show, the Sam and Friends show, aired before the evening news in Washington and before the Tonight Show. So it had that grown-up thing. And then when Sesame Street came around, people thought that the Muppets were for children because all those years of doing Sullivan and those primetime shows, they weren't really doing stuff for kids. And then Sesame Street got the Muppets known for being, performers for children, and so it made Jim struggle a little bit to get back to prime time. But that's one of the reasons that they did Saturday Night Live. They did a season on Saturday Night Live.
Yeah,
And I think it was Phil O'Donoghue. Now, Phil
Michael
O'Donoghue.
Michael
yes.
O'Donoghue.
Phil. No, no,
That's
this
a very
was the one
controversial
married.
talk show host you just came up with.
Because
I would have watched that show.
There was that Muppet of Marlo Thomas that they used to use.
Don't go there.
Yes.
Phil O'Donoghue.
Do you know anything about Danny Thomas?
I do know. I can tell you that neither Danny Thomas nor Cesar Romero ever did the Muppets.
Okay, good. You dodged that beautifully.
Deflecting
So-
that before we get there.
So Michael O'Donoghue, he said one of his famous lines that he said in a meeting at Saturday night was, "I don't write for felt."
Yes.
Shall we explain
And-
a little bit to our
and-
listeners
and-
who Michael O'Donoghue was? Yeah, he was the very well. How would you describe him?
Acerbic.
Acerbic is a great word. Yes, he was a Lampoon editor who became a writer at SNL and was famous for doing impressions of celebrities with their eyes gouged out by knitting needles.
And I think at that time also in SNL, Belushi referred to them as the mucking Fuppets.
The mocking Fuppets. Yeah, but if you read the early SNL books, there's a lot of animosity.
Well, the resentment
about
came
the Muppets.
From the Muppets had a regular slot in the show, and everybody else had to sort of jockey to get their airtime. They had to write their own bits, and the Muppets had this regular slot. So there was animosity because they weren't in the same competitive circle. And I think a lot of it, the Muppets ended up on SNL because of Bernie Brillstein. Bernie was Jim's manager, and he was the manager for a lot of talent. And he sort of packaged everything
Did
together.
you know that? That's how that's because he handled Aykroyd and Belushi.
Yeah.
That's how they got on Saturday Night Live. And you and I were talking about who were the characters? Was it Scorch or?
Well, it was the land of Gorch.
The Land of Gorch.
And there was Scred.
God, I haven't seen those in years.
King Plubus. Vaj.
They must be. Those shows must be intact from the first season if you get them on DVD.
The DVD has all the Muppet segments on them.
Right. And there was a lot of bad feeling about them. But you told me on the phone that they were only too happy to leave.
Yeah, because it was while they were doing SNL is when they got the offer to do the Muppet Show from Lou Grade, who had his own production entity in England.
Right. You remember watching those?
Oh, yeah.
What was your feeling about those at the time? And I don't want to offend, but I must say that I loved the early show, and I used to think that the Muppet segments kind of stopped the show in its tracks.
Well, I think there were a couple of them that worked. There was a great segment with Scred and Lily Tomlin singing "I Got You, Babe."
I do remember that one.
And I think when they were sort of more character-oriented like that, it worked. But sometimes they made fun of it eventually because they actually did things where Chevy Chase would interact with them in their boxes backstage.
I remember
they would be
that.
Complaining they weren't on the show that week.
Yeah. So they found a way to work them in.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I liked them a little bit more than the Bees.
Oh, yes.
So here's a fun thing. Oh, this is what I wanted to ask you about Sesame Street. We were talking on the phone, and Jim was the original. Was he the original Ernie?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And Carol Spinney was always Big Bird.
Carol Spinney was always Big Bird. And
how did he feel about the fact that he wanted to break into television? He had designed these characters that, as you say, were kind of adult, and the big breakthrough happened on a children's show.
Well, I think that he was very proud of the work he was doing on Sesame Street. I think the only time there was any frustration was that during that time they did a few primetime specials. They did Muppet Valentine's Show. They did a show. This will give you an idea of how Jim wanted to be known in prime time. They did a show called Sex and Violence with the Muppets. And, these were half-hour prime-time specials that were kind of like what the Muppet Show ended up becoming. And
go ahead.
No, I was just saying that that was really what Jim was trying to do while doing Sesame Street. But, he never stopped doing Sesame Street. It took a different amount of time in his life, but he stayed with it until he passed away.
Sure.
So what's Big Bird's name again? Carol
Spinney.
And so he was Big Bird when I was there.
Yeah.
And so, because I remember
there's another puppeteer who does Big Bird, who sort of does Big Bird when Carol's not available, Matt Vogel. But, Carol has been a primary Big Bird.
Because I remember when I was there with the kids, I wanted to have a picture of them with Big Bird. And I said, well, I'm not going to take a picture when he's hanging on the wall. And he got into costume. He put on the full costume just so he could take a picture.
That's nice.
No, he's a wonderful
guy. Do you remember when you did it? Do you remember what year this was?
Yeah.
It wasn't that long ago.
No, it wasn't that long.
You had children at the time.
Yeah. Well, not mine. I
of
just
course.
found them in a schoolyard.
That goes without saying. So Craig brought yet another clip that he's going to, and we'll actually go out on it. But this is fun, and we're going to have to do a part 2 because we have. I'm not going to say it, Frank. Frank has gotten on my case for saying we barely scratched the surface during every interview.
Yeah, he made a drinking game out of it.
He made a drinking game out of it. So I'm not going to say we that thing. I'm going to say we've just about
Do it, do it, do it, do it.
We've barely gotten into it.
Yes, and when we come back, another day, I have a game to play with you guys.
You do?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
lots of stuff.
So we're going to do a part 2 because we have to get into the
we
Muppet
barely
Show.
scratched the surface.
Don't take my catchphrase.
Yeah.
We'll get into the Muppet Show. We'll get into the movies. We'll get into all kinds of other stuff when we do a part 2. But for this part 1, Craig has brought us a little story, and he has a clip that goes with it.
Oh.
Well,
Okay.
a little story, before I get into the story, I do want to mention that our exhibit at the
I'm
Museum of
sorry.
the Moving Image
I forgot to
opens
plug.
July 22nd.
Shame on me.
And we do monthly screenings, so check out the Museum
That was
of the
the
Moving
reason we
Image.
timed it this
Yes.
way. July 22nd at the Museum
and
of the
if you're
Moving
in
Image.
Seattle, there's an exhibit at the Museum of Pop Culture now, and in Atlanta, there's an exhibit at the Center for Puppetry Arts.
So our friend Howard Kalin, who's in Seattle, can go see that. What is that called? The show at the Museum at the Moving Image?
It's called Jim Henson the Exhibition.
Jim. What an original name. So a name who has come up on this show maybe once or twice.
It's everybody's Uncle Milty.
Uncle Milty.
And the backstory
And
of this.
what was the reason Milton Berle's
I
name?
don't know.
I can't remember why his name and Danny Thomas's
Well, Danny
name.
Thomas, there was something about scratching a surface.
Yeah.
Which
But I don't know about Milty.
Milty, I think, scratched many surfaces.
He might have scratched a few surfaces. Some poor Micah.
Milton was a guest star on The Muppet Show. And while Jim always wanted the guest stars to try new things, Milton didn't always try new things. He liked things the way they were. So we have a little clip. Joe Bailey, who's one of the writers of The Muppet Show, who has a book out called Memoirs of a Muppet Writer.
Okay.
I told him I'd plug the book.
Plug Joe's book.
And Joe recorded with a little, audio cassette recorder this meeting of Milton Berle and the Muppet Show writers.
Did Milty know he was being recorded?
Yes, I think so because,
Okay.
when you listen to, I put together a little excerpt. When you listen to the whole thing, there's a couple of points where he says, turn that off or something like that. So I think that he knew that, he knew he was being recorded.
Okay, so we'll go out on the clip, and this is Uncle Milty being recorded, not secretly.
Yes, but he's sort of telling a room full of experienced comedy writers their business.
Okay, so we'll go. We'll take us out on the clip. So
Okay, so this has been Gilbert and Frank's Amazing Colossal Obsessions.
that's it with Craig Shemin, Muppet expert, and we'll do a part 2 very soon. Thank you, Craig.
It has been a joy and a pleasure.
The joy was ours.
You did the Uncle Milty, Uncle Sammy thing up there.
Well, that's new. That's new. That's never been done.
Ah, okay. Oh,
Uncle
okay.
Milty makes it. Uncle Sammy takes it.
Right. Talk about your book.
Yeah, my book.
Mm-hmm.
I'll have. Is it true, Mr. Burrell, that you wrote an autobiography of your life? Yes. And I'll say it. It's in its 5th printing. I'd have to take the whole joke myself. They can't feel me. The phrase forward blurred. And one thing I'd like you to try to do for me, seriously, to time your laugh track when you feed. Trust me. Trust me to have the next line.
Right.
Because I'll give the beat. I say, yeah, they were a phrase forward blurred. Next question, so you can lay it in, because they might say, the phrase forward blurred. Is it true then? And you won't be able to lay it in.
Yeah.
They can only laugh for 4.5 seconds. And that's the one I started on 2, 3, 4. I started that back in 1948. 2, 3, 4. To ourselves. I used to tell every actor. That's what Bob does. You work for Hope. He says, will you wait? And Bob always has the next line. You ever work for Jack Benny? You ever see Benny's script? Benny has the next line. He will never trust anybody in the show. For example, when he says, your money or your life.
Yeah.
That's the biggest joke, right?
Sure.
Bill Josephsburg wrote, your money or your life. But he stood. And the next line is say, well, Burtle says, well. And his joke is, I'm thinking, right? Before he said, well, he had to make a sound to give him the cue. Because he timed that for 35 seconds. That's how big the laugh was.
Oh,
Your money or your life? And he went,
That's it. It was,
and he went to
it was a
like this to the
building
audience.
laugh.